So, Chapter 10, Launching the New Ship of State. This chapter is also very important because it covers the administrations of Washington and John Adams, the two, the, the first two presidents, and a lot of the first things that the government, the legislature, does as well, which is huge, happens during these 12 or so years. So you definitely have to pay attention, read this chapter, know it backwards and forwards because it is heavily tested on the AP test, and obviously this is really the time period of the summer assignment Founding Brothers, so it's a really important chapter. So I put the Judiciary Act of 1789 here at the beginning because I didn't really know where else in the lecture to put it. It's a very important law. It basically sets up the whole judicial system in the country, which is pretty big, and it's going to later come into play for a Supreme Court case we're going to read in a couple of weeks, Marbury versus Madison. But one of the very first things that the Congress does is they pass the Judiciary Act of 1789. So this would be the first Congress under the Constitution 2.0. They organize the Supreme Court, where they create a Chief Justice and 5 other justices. So there's 6 members of the Supreme Court at this time, and they also set up the circuit courts. There's 3 circuits. You can see them there on the map. E, M, and S. I'm not real sure where they came up with those letters. They also set up district courts. So you can see district courts. And then also they set up the job of Attorney General, which is basically the head attorney who will represent the federal government in any cases against really anybody. So this law that's passed by Congress, it deals with the judicial branch. And when you study the Constitution, you'll notice that even though that Article 3 deals with the judicial branch and being separate from the legislative branch, it's very short, and it basically says that the legislature is the one that creates all of the courts outside of the Supreme Court, and yet the Supreme Court, the way it's made up, is also controlled by the legislature. So you really can see here at the outset that the Founding Fathers were very wary of arbitrary judges, such as they had, experienced under Great Britain. So they wanted to put the legislature firmly above as far as the power of the judicial branch. So let's get to the big guy, George Washington. He is unanimously voted by the Electoral College in 1789. He's by far the only president to be that way. I mean, oftentimes it's a very close vote. Sometimes it's not so close, but Washington is the only one that's ever been unanimously elected. There's nothing in the Constitution that discusses a cabinet, and that's why I have it in bold right here, because every president, including George Washington, has a cabinet. A cabinet is basically the leaders of the different departments of the executive branch. So obviously the head leader is going to be the president, and then there's 3 departments during the time of Washington. There's the State Department, the Treasury Department, and the War Department. And the heads of each of these departments are called secretaries. So the Secretary of State was Thomas Jefferson, the Secretary of the Treasury was Alexander Hamilton, and the Secretary of War was Henry Knox. And Washington would meet with these secretaries on a regular basis. When you combine the president and these secretaries, that's when you have the cabinet. So there's no discussion of this in the Constitution. Washington sets this precedent, and every single president since then, including up to now with Barack Obama, have had a cabinet and had regular cabinet meetings. This is a picture from your book of just the propaganda, really, the deification almost of George Washington. And his face was plastered everywhere alongside, the flags and words like liberty and freedom and peace and all this type of stuff. I mean, he really was a superstar from this time period. So you remember the fight between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists about whether or not to ratify the Constitution. And the only way that the Anti-Federalists would agree to ratify the Constitution would be if they got the firm promises that the very, very first Congress, who would come into session after this Constitution was ratified, that they would pass what is called a Bill of Rights. This Bill of Rights would protect individual and state rights. from arbitrary infringement by an all too powerful government. That was the fear that the Anti-Federalists had. The difficulty is that, according to the Constitution, it's very, very difficult to amend the Constitution. Not quite as difficult as the Articles of Confederation, which you'll recall required a unanimous vote by all of the states, but it's still they didn't want to make the Constitution easy to amend so that every Congress could basically pass whatever laws they wanted and just change the Constitution very easily. So the Constitution proposes two ways that it can be amended. If the states themselves hold conventions, and if 2/3 of the states hold these conventions and they request an amendment, they can be amended that way. Off the top of my head, I don't think that's ever happened. Or if 2/3 vote of both the House of Representatives and the Senate vote to amend the Constitution, then they do so, and then it goes to the states, who have to ratify it by the same requisite elements that was stated before. So that's how that latter event, or that latter process, is how they went about passing the first 10 amendments. And they basically passed them all in one big block, although there were several more that never did get ratified. In fact, there's one of them that was supposed to be part of the Bill of Rights that didn't actually make it into the Constitution until the 1990s, and that dealt with congressional pay increases. But at the end of the day, 10 of them were adopted in 1791. And collectively, they're known as the Bill of Rights. And there's they're, I want to say, almost in order of importance as far as the founding fathers were concerned, and you can kind of see that the protections are protected of freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of the press, right to bear arms, the right to be tried by a jury, the right to assemble, the right to petition a government, and it also has some prohibitions against the federal government. Prohibits cruel and unusual punishment, and prohibits federal government seizures of private property without a trial. That's what I mean by arbitrary. So here, as you can see, the evolution of the cabinet. You got Secretary of State, Secretary of Treasury, Secretary of War, and then the Attorney General is created after that Judiciary Act of 1789. Towards the end of this lecture, we're going to talk about the formation of the Secretary of the Navy during the XYZ crisis, and then you get the Postmaster General, Secretary of the Interior, Secretary of Agriculture, and then we jump into the 1900s, and you can see in the 1900s, as the federal government grew explosively, exponentially, so does the cabinet. And you see the closest, or the most recent cabinet member to be added is Secretary of Homeland Security, because the Congress, in the aftermath of 9/11, passed the Department of Homeland Security, where they kind of combined the FBI, the CIA, the NSA, a bunch of other security and intelligence agencies into one entity, so that they could easily share information. They planted a new cabinet member at the top. So our guy, Alexander Hamilton, he's the Secretary of the Treasury. So he's in the cabinet. Remember, he is very, very close to George Washington. George Washington, who never had a son, actually kind of viewed Alexander Hamilton as a surrogate son. Alexander Hamilton was, I believe, a lieutenant for George Washington during the Revolutionary War, so they had a very long history together. And Hamilton was a genius. I mean, he really was. He was an economic genius, and after the war, he becomes an attorney in New York, and he ends up representing the financial interests of the wealthy merchants in the New York area. And so when he enters the government, it's his job to fix the economy. Not just fix, but basically create an American economy. He was starting from scratch, because the Articles of Confederation, there really was no economy, and all these state economies needed to be kind of corralled, because they were out of control. Most of them had huge debts. It was just an absolute financial mess. The types of hurdles that Alexander Hamilton were facing in 1789 far exceed any hurdles faced by Franklin Delano Roosevelt in the 1930s, or George Bush or Barack Obama in this last recession. Alexander Hamilton had a lot on his plate that he had to deal with. So he wanted to set up our economy so that it favored the wealthy. And the idea is that if the wealthy could prosper under this environment, then they would continue to lend money to the government, In addition to that, they would lend political support, because you've got to remember this government is so new; it's really less than 10 years old. Uh, it was very fragile. Right? Countries, have come and gone in the blink of an eye before then and since then. And he and others in the government were worried that the same thing was going to happen to America, especially because they were having such horrible financial difficulties. So how do you build support, popular support from the people that matter? And the people that matter are the people with money. And his idea was to tie the wealthy to the successes of the federal government. He also needed to bolster the national credit. Now, you probably have heard of like having good credit and bad credit, right? If you have bad credit, you can't get loans. Or if you are able to get a loan, it's going to be at a ridiculously high interest rate. It's going to cost you a ton of money at the end of the day to pay back this loan. So he needs to improve America's credit, because remember the currency shortage under the mercantilist system, so that America can get loans from overseas to pay for all of the financial programs and whatnot. So how does he do this? How does he tie the wealthy to the government and also boost credit? Here's his plan, and you're going to need to know his plan. You're going to need to be able to write it in an essay, and you're also going to need to memorize the components for it, because it shows up all the time in multiple choice tests. It's also extremely important because we still operate in 2013 under Alexander Hamilton's plan. So remember, he's the Secretary of the Treasury, so he can't pass a law himself. All he can do is request Congress to pass laws, specifically the House of Representatives, to pass these financial bills. So he urges Congress to fund the entire national debt at par. And you need to, those two quotes there, fund and par, are kind of vocab terms. What they mean is the federal government has to pay off its debts at face value plus accumulated interest. So it can't just say, okay, we owe you $100, we're going to pay you $80. That doesn't work. In addition, a lot of the federal government's debts were incurred during the Revolutionary War, which at this point is 10, 15 years in the past. And so those debts, that if they initially borrowed $100 at 5% interest, now we're talking is in the 120s or something like that at this point. So that the federal government needs to pay back $120 for that $100 loan back in the past. In addition to that, the states themselves, remember, the ones that were actually conducting the war, and so he wanted the federal government to take on those debts so that the states would be debt free. The idea here is very similar to the wealthy, that the states would be tied to the federal government. And it would also, the states who owed money to the wealthy creditors, that these wealthy creditors then wouldn't look to the states for their money, they would look to the federal government. So once again, it's this idea of the federal government assuming the debts is actually tying the states and the wealthy to the federal government. So by going deeper into debt, he's actually increasing the power and the central focus of the federal government, which is kind of unique. So the states like Massachusetts, New York, basically the New England states, they absolutely loved Hamilton's plan. You got to remember, these are the type of people that were in Hamilton's inner circle anyway. And they liked this plan because they had a lot of debt. And so this notion of wiping the debt clean on the state level, and for these rich people, that they would be paid not just at the amount of money that they had been gathering, but with interest as well, that this is a great idea for them. States like Virginia and for most of the South that really didn't have a whole lot of state debt, they didn't want to support this. In fact, there's this big problem of a lot of Revolutionary War veterans who had basically sold their Continentals for cheap. So if they were supposed to get $100 in salary, they were selling these pieces of paper that they thought were useless to banks and rich people for maybe $5, $10 a piece. And so they were gone now. And so if these debts were going to be paid at par value, then whoever had possession of these Continentals would have gotten the $100 plus interest. So it's going to really enrich the financial interests of the New England area and really not help out the South at all. So the southern states, they weren't going to vote for this in the House of Representatives. And you remember, because of the 3/5 clause, and because population of Virginia, it wasn't going to occur without Virginia's support. So there's this famous dinner that happens, I think it was at Thomas Jefferson's house, where Hamilton was there and Jefferson was there, and they basically agreed to adopt Hamilton's financial plan if they would agree and pass a new law to move the capital of the country from New York City to the banks of the Potomac, which was right on the other side of the border with Maryland for Virginia. And so Maryland and Virginia would each give up a little bit of land, and the capital would be there. So the capital would technically be in the South, and the idea was that Virginia would have far more power and a larger say in government if the capital was in its own backyard. There's Alexander Hamilton there, another very pale-looking white guy. All the founding fathers shared that trait. Alright, so some more of Hamilton's plan. According to Hamilton, a national debt was a blessing. And I know we stated this a couple of slides, but it bears being repeated. The more creditors to whom the government owed money, so the more people who are looking to get repaid from the money they loaned the government, the more people with a personal stake in the success of that government. So it would be like if I gave one of you guys a loan, like a scholarship, basically, not a scholarship, a loan to go to college. College costs tens of thousands of dollars, probably another hundreds of thousands of dollars depending on where you go. I want you to pay me back though. Because of that, I'm going to make sure that you do a good job in college. I'm going to make sure that you get a good job after college, because if you don't go to a good college and you don't get a job, I'm never going to see my money again. So the same rationale goes here. If you get enough people who owe the federal government money, they're going to join the government. They're going to run for office. They're going to put pressure on the office holders, if they're not in, that the government is run efficiently and profitably, because that's how they're going to get repaid. So it was a good way of ensuring the success of the government by actually going into debt to people who are powerful and know what they're doing. But how do you finance? There's all this, going into debt. Eventually you have to start paying this stuff off. So how do you finance this debt, according to Alexander Hamilton? It's primarily with tariffs and customs duties. There's obviously the sale of federal lands, which you're going to make a ton of money off of that. But also there's taxes on a few key items. Basically an 8% tariff on just about all imports. So any good that came from outside of the country, once it enters a port in the United States, they would have to pay an automatic instant 8% tax on the value of those goods. So that's going to be a lot of money. And then there was a tax on a few domestic items, so stuff that's made within the United States. And the most important tax would be the tax on whiskey. This is a time period before there were good roads, and if you were a farmer out west, we're still talking basically the Appalachian Mountains and western Massachusetts and Pennsylvania and places like that. How are you going to get this wheat? How are you going to get this corn, right? Which when you harvest it, it's gigantic, right? Massive amounts. How are you going to get it to sell it? Because by the time you transport it east over crappy roads in at least carts, it's going to spoil. It's going to go bad. So there's no good way to get these gigantic crops to travel with them. So what farmers did is they distilled this into whiskey. Right? They turned the wheat, they turned the corn, they turned the barley into whiskey. And it's easier to transport barrels, which never go bad, as opposed to crops, which go bad quite quickly, especially if they get wet. So a lot of farmers even used whiskey as a form of currency, where they would trade it to get seed and livestock and stuff like that. And so they felt themselves that this was, wow, this really sucks. Now they're getting taxed on making something that they need. And this whole idea of taxation, remember, is very hostile to Americans during this time period anyway, because that's, of course, what the British were doing to them throughout the 1760s and 1770s. So here is just a graphic organizer which shows you the debt that's going on here under Hamilton's plan. You see that the state debt was over 21 million, the federal debt was over 42 million, and then the debt owed to foreigners was almost 12 million dollars. Now that sounds astronomically low in today's figures, but any kind of mid-sized corporation even has that amount of debt, in excess of that amount of debt today. But you can see, back then, especially when you didn't have a whole lot of revenue coming in, it was a big problem. All right, and probably the key component on how the federal government is going to operate Hamilton's plan hinges upon a bank, a centralized bank. So in Hamilton's report, he also proposed a centralized bank of the United States, and it would operate just like modern banks do. The thing about this bank in the United States, though, is that it would be a private enterprise. It wouldn't be part of the government. Now, the government would be a major stockholder, but it wouldn't technically own the bank outright. And so rich people could also be stockholders in this bank. The federal government, any type of money that it would get, it would deposit all of its money into this bank. Now, banks, when they take your money, they don't just store it up in a vault and it never, sees the light of day again. What banks do is they use that money and then they loan it to people for handing out loans, mortgages, stuff like that. So Hamilton's idea is that the federal government, if it had excess money, it would go into this bank, and then this bank would give loans to people. So that would stimulate business. It would provide a spark to help out industry. Banks back then were also the ones that printed up money. And so if you had all of the federal government's money in one spot, then this one spot would print up the government's money. So this would be a place to actually provide a national currency. Because remember, a big problem was that each state was printing up their own money. And in fact, any bank could really print up its own money. And so how do you do business when you're trying to keep track of what all these different entities that their cash looks like and is worth, and if you're trying to exchange it for other cash, are you getting robbed? Whereas if you have one centralized form of currency, then there is no need to exchange the money for anything else because that is the only money in town. So that provides a very centralized, easy way of doing business. Now Thomas Jefferson hates the bank. He absolutely hates the idea of going into debt and all this centralized stuff, financial stuff, because he felt it took way too much power away from the states and it gave way too much power to the federal government. He also, under the Constitution, under the Ninth Amendment, and I forget what article is specifically in the Constitution itself, stated that all powers not specifically given to the federal government were retained by the states. He also believed in something called strict construction, and that is, if you want to see if the federal government can do something under the Constitution, you have to point out exactly where in the Constitution it says that the federal government can do that. By that notion, he felt that states were the only ones that had the power to charter banks and not the federal government. Because of all this, and because it became apparent that Hamilton was going to win, and Hamilton had more support in the federal government because Hamilton was a Federalist and definitely had definitely had the ear of George Washington, and he had his own lackeys in Congress. Thomas Jefferson eventually gets so fed up with this that he essentially retires. He resigns. He's not Secretary of State anymore, and he quits the government. He goes back to Monticello, and he starts hiring people to basically, write negative commentaries about Alexander Hamilton and the Federalists in general. And slowly this turns into the first opposition political party. He does so with James Madison, who, ironically enough, used to be a Federalist. Right? Madison was one of the ones, along with John Jay and our guy Alexander Hamilton, who wrote the Federalist Papers, who were advocating the ratification of the Constitution. Now, what happens? What makes Madison change his mind? You got to remember that when all the Constitutional Convention was going on, Thomas Jefferson was in France. If Thomas Jefferson would have been around, he would not have supported the Constitution. He would have voted against ratification, and because Madison was kind of his protege, Madison probably wouldn't have either. So the change of heart that Madison has basically occurs once Thomas Jefferson comes back to the United States. This first opposition political party, it slowly becomes known as the Democratic Republicans. And they would call them, at that time, the Republicans for short. But this party actually evolves and slowly, over time, over the next several decades, becomes the Democrats. So the modern Democrat Party, of which Barack Obama is the president, They traced their roots to the Democratic Republicans, kind of founded by Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. And of course, during the Madison-Jefferson years, they were called the Republicans. So good luck figuring that one out. There you go. There's the evolution of the major parties. So you got the Federalists, and they kind of ceased to exist in the 18 teens. And then there's a one-party system that occurs in our country for a long time. And then it splits again. It's Andrew Jackson's fault, if you want to call it that. And then a bunch of the anti-Jacksonians become kind of a motley of different parties, especially a party called the Whigs. And then in 1854, the modern Republican Party is born. Whereas on the other side, you got, like I said in the last slide, the Democratic Republicans, and then they become just the Republicans, and then just the Democratic Republicans again, and then if you side with Andrew Jackson, it's a Jacksonian Democrat, which becomes just a Democrat, and that's what we have. This is a political cartoon where it's pro farmer, and you can see here that the farmer has his whiskey, and of course the typical thing to do to a tax collector, it seems, in every chapter is to tar and feather and then lynch the tax collector. So the farmers were not happy at all about this excise tax on whiskey. Okay, so what do? Well, they rebel. Remember, so we got Bacon's Rebellion, we got the Regulators, we got the Green Mountain, or I forget the other one. You got Shays Rebellion, now you got the Whiskey Rebellion. It happens in western Pennsylvania, 1794, and it's basically because they hated the excise tax on the whiskey. So they tarred and feathered a bunch of tax collectors. They grabbed their guns and they started marching around the state, threatening to burn stuff up. So President George Washington summons a bunch of state militias, obviously mostly the Pennsylvania militia, and he actually goes on the warpath. He's in command. So it's kind of odd that the president himself would command troops, given that we would never expect Barack Obama to be piloting aircraft or leading the charge in Afghanistan nowadays. But this was only 10 years after the Revolutionary War, and really the only military guy that we had around was George Washington anyway. As soon as the rebels saw that this big mass of soldiers was coming at them with George Washington at the head, they gave up. The rebellion just petered out very quickly. Now the important thing is it showed that having a strong federal government, a strong executive, a strong commander in chief is able to crush rebellions much more effectively than what happened during Shays' Rebellion in Massachusetts just a few years earlier, right, where there was no executive branch, and basically just rich people in Massachusetts had to hire mercenaries to try and stop this rebellion. So it showed that the Constitution was good. It showed that the Constitution was effective, giving the federal government enough power to prevent this type of violence and anarchy. French Revolution. So this is a painting of the storming of the Bastille, and that's because that's what's happening in 1789 in France during all this time period. Ironically enough, just a few blocks from the Bastille is the hotel that Thomas Jefferson was staying in when this all went down, and there's a lot of evidence that he actually participated in the storming of the Bastille. So he may be in one of the crowds here, and it definitely had an influence on him, an effect on him, and he became a big fan of France, and he thought that democracy under the ideals of the Declaration of Independence, which he plagiarized, would spread throughout the world. Of course, what happens in the French Revolution? Well, they don't just overthrow the government. They start lopping off heads, and you can see here they stuck one of the heads on a stake, and they killed the queen and the king, and then they started killing each other. So the French Revolution really spirals out of control into a very, very violent upheaval that you just don't see in America. This is the key to the Bastille prison, and it is hanging in Mount Vernon in George Washington's house. It was actually given to him as a gift, which you can imagine that's quite it's like the ultimate key to the city type of gift. As like a thing of friendship between America and this new French Republic, because the French Republic kind of traces their ideological roots to the American Revolution. Now, here's the cool thing: if you go to Mount Vernon, and you go to basically as soon as you walk in the door, this key is just kind of hanging above your head on the wall. I mean, it's this huge artifact in really world history, and it's very, very accessible to anybody who visits Mount Vernon. So that's pretty cool. The problem is that France, when they go through this violence and they start becoming, an early form of a dictatorship under Napoleon, uh, they just they start invading the rest of Europe and trying to forcefully spread democracy throughout Europe. And of course, this goes directly against what's going on in most of Europe, but especially their old enemy, Great Britain. So Great Britain and France go to war versus each other, and Great Britain essentially is controlling the oceans, and France controls the land. And so they fight for decades. They fight once again, and this is a problem because America still has this treaty with France. It says it will be their military allies forever, and yet we still have very, very strong connections with our former colonial masters, the British. So it's real easy for us to get sucked into yet another war. You remember the French and Indian War, the Revolutionary War, and then possibly this war as well. Would be fought on American soil between Indians, the French, and the British, and the Americans, and Washington didn't want that. He wanted us to stay out of this one. And his idea was we were too fragile of a notion, or too fragile of a nation, but our population growth was so big and our economy was growing at a pretty good clip too, that if we could avoid European wars for a generation, so for 20 years or so, then at the end of the 20 years we would have a big enough population and enough resources that we could actually conduct a war versus these other European powers. So in 1793, the U.S. government proclaims neutrality in the widening war. This pisses off France because we were reneging on a treaty, a military treaty that we had with them, and let's face it, that they adhered to during our old Revolutionary War, and we wouldn't have won without France's help. And here we are, 15 years later, turning our backs on France. So France sends over a guy by the name of Edmund Genet. It's Genet, and the American government basically says, too bad, we're neutral. And so Genet ignores that, and he actually tries to, I don't want to say form treaties with, but he tries to do business with and recruit Americans to join the French army, and he tries to get supplies for the French army and French Navy and all this type of stuff. He's going, in other words, around the official U.S. government to try and secure what are in essence military treaties just with private individuals, with states, which is random people in America, and the whole time he's dissing the federal government, he's dissing George Washington. So eventually, Washington demands Genet's withdrawal, just kicks him out, and says that if you want to do business with America in time of war on an official capacity, because Genet was an official person in a member of the government in France, that you have to go through proper channels, and that's the federal government. So it's another instance of the federal government saying, look, you do not look for foreign affairs, you don't look to the states or private individuals, you look to the federal government. Even though we declared our neutrality throughout this time period, the British, who are definitely not our friends, they would just seize American merchant ships. So if they saw a boat flying the American flag in the Atlantic or in the Caribbean, a British warship would force it to stop, and they would steal the ship, they would steal the cargo, and they would force all of the American sailors to become British seamen and fight in the war. Basically, you're enslaving American sailors. This process of kidnapping is called impressment. So that's definitely a vocab term that you're going to need to know. So the impressment of U.S. sailors is when you kidnap them off American ships. They may even stay on that very same ship, but now it's going to fly the British flag and it's going to fight the French or carry British cargo. So we obviously have problems with Britain. And so John Jay is sent to Britain to try and avert war, and he's hurt in that we are negotiating from a position of weakness. We don't have a whole lot of leverage. We don't have a whole lot to give Britain, and they weren't really worried about us from a military perspective. And then also, Alexander Hamilton, even though he's our guy, he was such a fan of the British, and he was so worried that we would go to war against Britain that he basically gave all of our secrets to Britain in this negotiation. So the stuff that we really wanted to get, he told the British in code, and the stuff that we were willing to negotiate for and give in areas, he also told the British. So the British really were able to get exactly what they wanted from a position of power in Jay's Treaty. But here are the details. The British promised to evacuate the chain of posts on U.S. soil to remove British soldiers who were manning these posts and patrolling these posts, which was a nice gesture, except for the fact that that's in the Treaty of Paris that ended the Revolutionary War. So now they're just saying, okay, now this time, 15 years later, now we're going to do it. Britain agreed to pay for damages to the recent seizure of American ships, which is nice, except for the fact that they didn't agree to stop seizing new ships or supplying weapons to the Indians. So we have a big problem off the west. You remember Pontiac's Rebellion and all that good stuff, where the Indians are killing frontiersmen and vice versa, and the Indians are using British guns. So the British agree to pay for the shipping that they steal, but they didn't agree to stop stealing. Now, what did America have to give up for all this? All debts that were still owed to the British merchants on pre-revolutionary accounts, which again, that's almost like the first point. We should have done that anyway, and we had agreed to do that in our own treaty. So there's that. So who benefits and who doesn't? The planters, even though they weren't heavily in debt from the Revolutionary War, they were heavily in debt to British creditors from the pre-Revolutionary War time period. So they would now, 20 years later, have to repay these debts, and yet they weren't really getting anything from Jay's Treaty. However, the Federalists had a lot of support in the merchant class, especially in New England and New York. And so these owners of ships who had been impressed on, the banks who had made loans to these shippers and insured the cargo and stuff like that, they were losing out every time a British vessel stole an American vessel. And so the idea that the British would repay the Americans for doing this, it's going to help pay back and enrich the Federalists. So in other words, the Federalists, who are from New York and New England, they were benefiting by Jay's Treaty, and consequently enough, who's the guy in this area? That's Alexander Hamilton. Whereas the plantation class in the South, i.e. Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, they would not benefit from Jay's Treaty. So it further causes a rift among the founding brothers, to use the term from your book, and it helps solidify the two kind of nascent political. Alright, so basically because his second term sucked so bad, and he was getting old and starting to get sick and feeling the stress, Washington, agreed not to run for a third term, and then he gives his farewell address, which, as far as I know, was never written. It was never spoken. It was just written. And in the farewell address, he warns against permanent alliances, because of course the one with France. He establishes the two-term precedent, and he also warns against political parties, because political parties in Britain he viewed as a bad thing, and he saw that Americans were starting to form political parties here, and he didn't like it. He wanted more of the egalitarian unity, that whole civic virtue where everybody came together and tried to create a good government, all that other stuff. Now, the other treaty that is tested on during this time period is Pinckney's Treaty, 1795, with Spain. And this is where Spain quits treating us poorly. Remember how they were under the Articles of Confederation? So we got free navigation on the Mississippi River. We got right of deposit at New Orleans. What right of deposit means is that if you had a boat full of, let's say, corn that's going down the Mississippi River, you'd be able to stick it into a Spanish warehouse in New Orleans, and then it would sit there as you found, or while you found a buyer overseas. So then they would pick up that corn from the warehouse and put it on an ocean vessel and then ship it to wherever. They also gave up the disputed territory of western Florida, which was basically the coastal Arkansas, Alabama area. There's our guy, John Adams. Short, mean, a Federalist, but also a realist from Massachusetts. The French, they hated Jay's Treaty. They viewed it as kind of a reforming of the old colonial connections, and definitely that America was moving closer into Britain's camp and away from France's camp. They were already pissed off at us at the Neutrality Proclamation. So French warships started doing the exact same thing the British warships were doing. They were seizing American ships, seizing American cargo, and impressing American sailors. So there had to be, and I don't recall ever specifically reading this, but there had to be ships, right, manned by American sailors that flew under the British flag, fighting against French ships manned by American sailors fighting the French flag, and these sailors, of course, were doing both under duress and not of their own free will. So that's unfortunate. And of course, the French refused to meet with any sort of U.S. envoy. So they didn't accept American ambassadors to try and hammer out our differences. Brings us to the XYZ affair, 1797. John Marshall, who later earns fame as Chief Justice of the Supreme Court for decades, is sent to Paris along with a couple other guys from America to try and stop this French impressment. French Foreign Minister Talleyrand flat out refused to talk with them, so they're just kind of chilling out in Paris for a long time. Eventually, 3 unnamed individuals, who are later identified as X, Y, and Z, meet with John Marshall and the other Americans, and they demand a bribe. And if they received this bribe, then the door would be open and they would actually be able to negotiate with Talleyrand. So Marshall says, screw you, basically. And he sails back to the United States, and he doesn't keep this a secret at all. He basically tells everybody. So not only the government, but also the press. The American public goes nuts, and this is where you see the famous quote, millions for defense, but not 1 cent for tribute. And so under the John Adams administration, the Navy Department is created. The Marine Corps is reestablished. A 10,000 troop army is authorized, and basically any American who wants to can grab a boat and steal a French boat if they want to. It's kind of like legalized piracy. They're called privateers. The French, of course, like they always do, they back down and they give in. They let the American ambassadors hammer out their differences with the French, and they don't require any sort of tribute or bribe anymore. This is a political cartoon about the XYZ affair. America, once again, is depicted as a woman. Seems like we always are. She's not an Indian this time, and she actually looks like a little bit like Lady Liberty. Meanwhile, X, Y, and Z are demanding their money here. Excuse me. And you can see across the English Channel is England. England looking kind of smirking at the problems that we're having with the French. You can see here diplomatic prerequisites, national sack. It's filled with riches and all that good stuff. This is a picture from your book talking about the creation of the Navy Department, and America starts building a bunch of warships. It takes a long time to build these ships, and so they're not really even ready until the XYZ affair already cools down, and our problems with France, to a certain extent, are mitigated. 2 other things during the Adams administration that you have to know are the Alien and Sedition Acts, which have been called a Federalist witch hunt. So we have a lot of people who are immigrating to America during this time period, especially to escape the hostilities of Europe. And for the most part, they, even if they're moving to the north, because most of the people are immigrating to the north as opposed to the south, they're not voting for Federalists. They didn't have as much money, they didn't have land, so they just more naturally congregated to this Democratic Republican Party. The Federalists, who are in control of Congress, of course, they don't like this. So they raised the residency requirements from 5 years to 14 years before you could become a citizen. So this automatically would just tack on another 10 years or so before they had to worry about all these immigrants voting against Federalists. They also gave the president the power to deport dangerous foreigners in times of peace, so to kick them out of the country, or to imprison them in times of war. So this gives the president a lot of power that probably violates the Constitution to just either kick out of the country or arrest people really for no good reason. They don't define what dangerous means. It's probably up to the president to define what dangerous means. He could define having a mustache as dangerous, in other words. The Sedition Act was even worse because it goes directly against the First Amendment. Under the Sedition Act, anyone who falsely defamed an official, including the president, was liable to fines and imprisonment. So anyone who spoke out against the president, as long as it was a lie, boom, he could go to prison. And they did this to a lot of individuals, none of which were Federalists, right? So they just kept locking up anybody who spoke out against the president. And as far as whether or not it's true or not, who gets to decide that? Well, a Federalist judge. You can imagine that Thomas Jefferson hated the Alien and Sedition Acts, and so he, along with James Madison, write the Virginia and Kentucky Resolutions. And the Virginia and Kentucky Resolutions really flesh out this theory called the Compact Theory. And the Compact Theory states that when we founded our country, it was an agreement between 13 states, and that these 13 states agreed to enter into a compact or a contract, and that the national government was created from this contract. And if the states felt that the federal government had exceeded its authority by passing a law that they didn't like, then a state could nullify that law within its boundaries. So in other words, Virginia, if it didn't like the Alien and Sedition Acts, it could vote to say that the Alien and Sedition Acts do not exist within the boundaries of Virginia. Now, the Federalists, on the other hand, argued that the states didn't make up the original contract, the people did. And you can even look at the Constitution where it says, we the people, in order to form a more perfect unit. It doesn't say we the states, it says we the people. And because of that a state could not nullify federal legislation. Only the people could, and that process is done through amending the Constitution or electing new members to the federal government legislature who would overturn the law. There's Thomas Jefferson right there. Oh, look, a pale white guy. Here's the formation of these political parties. So here are the platforms of these two political parties that are formed, which are the first political parties in our nation's history. The Federalists, who in general supported large government, and the Democratic Republicans, otherwise known as the Jeffersonians, otherwise known as the Republicans, otherwise known as modern Democrats, at the time favored small government and states' rights. The ironic thing is the modern Democratic Party is actually aligned with the Federalists over here. So there's an obvious switch, but we'll talk about when that switch happens throughout this course of the school year. So the Federalists, they believed in a loose interpretation of the Constitution, that concentration of wealth in the hands of the rich and big business and the federal government was a good thing. They wanted a protective tariff. They tended to be pro-British and against the French. They liked a national debt. They liked a large bureaucracy, which means lots of federal government workers. They wanted a national bank. As far as the Alien Sedition Acts, they wanted restrictions on freedom of speech, and they wanted a strong navy. The Democratic Republicans, on the other hand, wanted democracy expanded to almost everything. Almost everybody got the vote, even at the local level. A weak federal government, strong state governments. They believed in strict interpretation of the Constitution. They were more agrarian, so in other words, they believed in a more rural type of economy. No special favors, no taxes or tariffs or anything like that to help out manufacturers. They tended to be pro-French. They despised the national debt. They wanted fewer federal government workers. They wanted state banks as opposed to a national bank. They wanted free speech because they were on the losing end of that Alien Sedition Act. and they wanted, as little of a navy and army as possible. And then here's our good old friend, the last slide, chronology. You see 1789, the Constitution is formally put into effect. You get our favorite Judiciary Act of 1789. Washington begins his presidency. The French Revolution begins. So a lot of stuff happened in 1789. 1791, the Bill of Rights is adopted, and this is when Alexander Hamilton's plan is put into act. So this is when the bank is created and the excise tax is passed. Washington's reelected in 92, and 92, 93, this is when America starts to form these two political parties. 1793, France declares war on Britain and Spain. You get Washington's Neutrality Proclamation, and you get the Citizen Genet Affair. 1794, you get the Whiskey Rebellion, and you get Jay's Treaty. 1795, you get Pinckney's Treaty. 1796, you get Washington's Farewell Address. 1797, you get our second president becomes president, John Adams, and you also get the XYZ Affair. 1798, you get the Alien Sedition Acts, and then later on that year, you get the Virginia and Kentucky Resolutions, and then you get kind of the peace with France in 1800 or so. So you can see this chapter had lots of stuff going on in it, and pretty much everything I said on this slide is tested on quite heavily.